On January 28th, 1986, NASA began the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger on its 10th mission on a cold and frigid morning. 73 seconds into its flight, disaster ensued as the shuttle was engulfed in a massive fireball, causing the orbiter to break apart, claiming the lives of all 7 astronauts on board, most notably including New Hampshire teacher Christa McAuliffe, who would have been the first civilian to fly into space. What happened? What caused this deadly disaster? Let's look into the Challenger and find out as Something Spacey This Way Comes. Hello, and welcome to Something This Way Comes. I'm your host, Andrew, and with me is my lovable but silent co-host, Frank D. Reaper. Tonight we're looking into the Challenger disaster. The Challenger began life as the STA-099, which stands for Structural Test Article 099. The parts that would become the airframe and body of the orbiter Challenger were initially used by the Space Shuttle program to test the effects of launch and re-entry stress on a lightweight frame. Since computers in the 70s sucked, seriously, they were like the dinosaurs, as big as a room with the brain of a peanut. They sent it out for a year-long intensive vibration and thermal testing, or, as I like to call it, some shake and bake. From 1972 to 1975, components for it and the Space Shuttle Columbia were manufactured. Assembly took nearly 3 years to complete, after which it faced a year-long of grueling tests. Once completed, NASA would award Rockwell International the contract to convert STA-099 to OV-099 orbital vehicle. Once the conversion was complete, NASA began the process of renaming the shuttle. They settled on Challenger, naming her after the HMS Challenger, a British corvette which served as the command ship for the Challenger expedition, which was a huge scientific expedition in the 1870s, and the Apollo 17 lunar module, making it the only space shuttle to be named in honor of another spaceship that landed on another celestial body. In April 1983, after the 5th successful launch of the Columbia, NASA sent the Challenger on its maiden voyage. In addition to testing the new shuttle in space, the mission deployed the first tracking and data relay satellite. Once completed, this network of satellites would allow communications between space and ground control stations anywhere in orbit, versus only being able to communicate when the shuttle was directly over the communications network's ground station antenna. They also tested out the spiffy new spacesuit designed exclusively for use in the new shuttles, as well as conducting the first spacewalk of the Space Shuttle program, the first American spacewalk in over 9 years. The mission ended successfully, with the Challenger making a runway landing in California. The second mission was the first flight of an American woman, Sally Ride. She was the third woman in space following cosmonauts Valentina Tereshkova in 1963 and Svetlana Savitskaya in 1982. At the age of 32, she was also the youngest American astronaut in space. This mission was the first time data was transmitted through the TDRS network to the ground, and NASA engineers, being the geniuses that they are, also estimated that the single female astronaut would need 100 tampons for her week-long flight in space. They also decided that any woman going into space would want to look her best, so they designed a makeup kit especially for space travel. These damn NASA nerds, they sure know what women really want. The third mission was the first nighttime launch of a space shuttle, carrying the first African American into space, United States Air Force Colonel Guion Bluford. He was second behind Cuban Arnaldo Tamayo Mendez in 1980. As a crew member of Soyuz 38, Arnaldo was the first Cuban citizen, first Latin American, first person of African descent, and the first person from a country in the Western Hemisphere other than the U.S. to travel into Earth orbit. This flight would also start the concern over potential catastrophic failures of the solid rocket booster during flight, following discovery of malfunctions during the post-flight casing inspections. The fourth mission saw astronauts Bruce McCandless and Robert L. Stewart perform the first untethered spacewalk in history, traveling 320 feet away from the shuttle using the Manned Maneuvering Unit, nerd name for jetpack. This would make McCandless the first human Earth-orbiting satellite. Mission 6 was the first time a crew of 7 would fly into space. The first mission to carry 2 women into space, and oh, how I feel for those guys. Mark Gurnew would become the first Canadian in space. Catherine D. Sullivan would be the first American woman to make a spacewalk. And Paul D. Scully Power would be not only the first Australian-born person in space, but the first astronaut in space to rock a beard. The 7th mission, during post-flight inspections of the solid rocket boosters, it was discovered one of the boosters had a failure similar to what would occur on the Challenger's final mission, making it the second serious O-ring issue discovered in 2.5 months. During an earlier launch of the shuttle Discovery, the primary O-rings in both solid rocket boosters were found to be severely charred, with the biggest concern being the complete burn through of the primary O-ring, heavy charring, and degradation of the secondary O-ring in the center field joint of the right solid rocket booster. Investigations into the failures would lead to the understanding that cold temps at the time of launch significantly reduced the sealing power of the O-rings. Temperatures at the time of launch was 53 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 20 degrees warmer than the Challenger would experience a year later. And these O-rings, they weren't tiny. They were just under 2 inches thick and 60 feet wide. They circled the entire rocket booster and were used to seal the sections of the booster together. The 8th Challenger mission was the first and only mission to abort after launch due to an engine failure. The 9th mission was the first and only time 8 people would launch into space at the same time. The mission was entirely dedicated to the German Space Lab. The Space Lab mission involved 75 numbered experiments, which were conducted multiple times. While the Challenger was controlled through Mission Control Houston, the scientific operations were controlled from the German Space Operations Center near Munich. Finally, the 10th and final mission. After days of numerous delays, Challenger's flight crew, Commander Francis R. Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, Mission Specialist 1, Judith A. Resnick, Mission Specialist 2 and Flight Engineer, Ellison Onizuka, Mission Specialist 3, Ronald E. McNair, Payload Specialist 1, Gregory B. Jarvis, and Payload Specialist 2, Krista McAuliffe, boarded the Challenger. The record low temperatures of this chilly morning could not deter the throngs of reporters on site to watch the highly publicized launch of the first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, who would have taught lessons from space. Along with the reporters and numerous other people that had gathered to witness the launch, Christie's class of 18 students were there to see her off. At exactly 11:38 Eastern Standard Time, Challenger's SRBs ignited, launching it on the 25th Space Shuttle flight. After achieving proper alignment to reach orbit and hitting an altitude of over 46,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean at 11:39 and 13 seconds, a massive fireball surrounded the shuttle, causing it to tear itself apart. The crew compartment and other remaining parts continued to fly higher before plummeting to the ocean. The boosters, having survived the destruction and set free, would continue to fly for 30 seconds before being detonated by the range safety officer, ensuring they would never cause havoc by reaching landfall. So what happened? The 36-degree temperature at the time of launch compromised the O-rings that sealed the joint between 2 segments of the right-hand booster. Upon ignition and pressurization, this seal failed, spewing hot gases which miraculously sealed itself with slag from the metallic rocket fuel. The plug held until it hit wind shear, where it was highly stressed by aerodynamic forces. At this point, the plug failed, releasing a stream of hot liquid and solids through the hole. This jet of flame grew until it cut the aft strut, holding the booster to the central tank. Freed from the center, the bottom of the rocket moved outwards, forcing the nose of the rocket into the central oxygen tank. The sudden dumping of oxygen into a hydrogen-rich air fire caused an explosion which overloaded the center tank, causing it to collapse, freeing the orbiter and both booster rockets as the rocket fuel burned explosively. The boosters continued to fly under their own thrust until detonated. The Challenger's engines forced the shuttle to pitch up violently broadside to the supersonic winds, which abruptly tore the shuttle to pieces. The severed crew cabin and other debris continued to travel upwards for thousands of feet before plummeting back down to the ocean. The crew was believed to have survived the initial breakup of the shuttle. Numerous switches had been moved as if the crew was trying desperately to save the doomed shuttle. Emergency air breathing packs had been activated sometime after the shuttle tore apart. Since the crew didn't wear any type of pressurized suits, these air packs wouldn't have been activated until after the cabin had lost pressure, which wouldn't have happened until well after the explosion of the center tank. There's also different speculations on when they died, with some sources saying they would have died from oxygen deficiency before they hit the ocean, while another source says some of the remains had fluid in the lungs, meaning they were still alive and breathing when they hit the ocean. An intensive salvage operation was launched within days of the disaster, recovering hundreds of pounds of metal from the Challenger. In March 1986, the remains of the astronauts were recovered in what was left of the crew cabin. All of the important pieces of the shuttle were retrieved by the end of NASA's investigation. However, most of the shuttle would remain in the ocean. 10 years later, 2 large pieces washed up on Cocoa Beach, believed to be part of the left wing flap. After being verified, the parts were placed in 2 abandoned missile silos with the rest of the approximately 5,000 recovered pieces, weighing 250,000 pounds. In the aftermath of the disaster, President Reagan postponed the State of the Union address, the first time a president had ever done so. Instead, he gave what is considered the best speech of his presidency regarding the tragedy.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union, but the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista Mikaloff. We mourn their loss as a nation together. To the families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
Shortly after, President Reagan appointed a special commission to determine the cause and develop corrective measures. The commission was headed by former Secretary of State William Rogers and included former astronaut Neil Armstrong and former test pilot Chuck Yeager. Their investigation revealed the O-ring failure caused the disaster. They also found Morton Thiokol, the designer of the rocket boosters, ignored repeated warnings about potential issues and that NASA managers were aware of these issues and failed to take action. Scientist Richard Feynman, a member of the commission, famously demonstrated to the public the O-ring flaw with nothing more than an ordinary glass of ice water. NASA underwent a massive shakeup, instituting numerous safety checks, a new safety office, and a shuttle safety advisory panel. Morton Thiokol would go on to completely redesign these boosters to eliminate the failures and make them safer. And it would be over 2 years before another shuttle launch would occur. Plans to fly civilians into space were canceled for over 20 years. In 2007, Barbara Morgan, who was Krista McCullough's backup, would fly aboard the shuttle Endeavour. Alright, now for some conspiracies. NASA officials felt intense pressure to push ahead with the Challenger after repeated delays due to getting the Columbia back on the ground. Rumors persisted that the White House was exerting pressure to push ahead with the launch to connect the shuttle or its astronauts with the upcoming State of the Union address. Another conspiracy says 6 of the 7 astronauts survived and are living new lives under new names, with NASA scamming the country to justify its existence and cause some kind of collective trauma out of cruelty amongst the masses of children watching the shuttle launch around the nation. The only real evidence for this theory is also very easy to disprove. That being the evidence was nothing but photos of people who looked somewhat like what the aged astronauts would have looked like. Most of the photos found ended up being nothing more than photos of relatives of the astronauts, mostly brothers and cousins. Time for an interesting fact. Carol Spiney, the puppeteer inside the giant yellow feathered suit known as Big Bird, was once invited by NASA to orbit the Earth dressed as Big Bird to encourage kids to get interested in space. He was the first civilian to be asked to go to space. The thought was taking civilians to space would get the general public excited about space travel. To do that, NASA developed the Space Flight Participation Program. Spidey, however, never applied. Despite this, NASA contacted Sesame Street with a proposal to send Big Bird to space. At this time, Big Bird was a huge worldwide celebrity. It was never released why this never happened, although the puppet being over 8 foot tall may have had something to do with it. There's not a lot of room on a shuttle, and a big ass yellow bird probably not going to fit too well. In 2015, NASA confirmed talks with Sesame Street, but the plan was never approved. And that was the Challenger disaster. Thanks for listening, and please consider leaving a rating or review on whatever app you're using. And if you have any questions or comments, you can email the show directly at podsomething@gmail.com. Thank you and good... Wait, hold on. Hear me out. I got one more conspiracy theory. Wasn't going to add it in. Really hesitated with this one. It kind of hits close to home. You won't find this online or anywhere else since it exists solely in my head. January 28th, 1986. The day of the disaster. Do you know what else happened on that day? That's right. My older sister, do mean older, it was her sweet 16th birthday. What else would a 16-year-old in the 80s want? Well, the same thing any 16-year-old wants. A brand new car. Did my dad, with all the people he knew and all the contacts he had, conspire with the NASA nerds to delay the launch and sacrifice the astronauts in some weird, elaborate satanic ritual? I mean, this was during the height of the satanic panic, after all. Did they do this just so my sister could have a brand new car? And what car could she want and get? Why, nothing but the best. Because she got, check this out, a brand new Ford Escort Pony. That's right. That sexy 3-door hatchback from the mid-'80s that I'm sure made her the envy of all her high school friends. All right. And that's all I got on that one. Thanks and goodbye. Love you, sis.